Hey, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming to this panel. I see many of you have brought coffee, and my goal is that none of you will need it, because we're going to have a really invigorating and enlightening and just attention-grabbing discussion about Scope 3, the segment of the economy that is just so huge and so, amorphously defined, and it encompasses all of our indirect emissions. My name is Debra Kahn. I'm the California policy editor for Politico, and I edit our California climate newsletter, which comes out every day, and it's free. So you can just Google California Climate Politico and sign up, and you'll get dispatches from this conference and from everything else that our team of 4 reporters around the state is tracking. And then here is my illustrious panel that I'll introduce this direction. So we have Michael Gillenwater, co-founder and executive director of the Greenhouse Gas Management Institute. We have Mandy Rambharos, CEO of Verra, which certifies offset projects. And we have Jessica Campbell, director of asset innovations for ClimeCo, which develops and trades and transacts emission reduction projects. We also had a longtime offset protocol expert, Robert Parkhurst, who had to bow out, so we'll have to do without his expertise. But tell me questions that you have for him, and I'll pass them on, and we can get some back and forth going. So what we're gonna talk about today, and over the next hour, we're gonna get into the ongoing debate around Scope 3, what it is, how to address it, how effective it is as a concept, the role that it plays or should play or could play in companies' mitigation strategies, what the current thinking from leading lights like SBTi and VCMI and Verra and others is, whether this is an opportunity or a burden or somewhere in between for companies. And I'm going to strive to keep this pretty high level and accessible. And I'm going to, draw on the panelists' expertise and also you guys to steer the discussion later on, whatever direction you want. So think of questions. We'll open the last 10 minutes or so to that. So just to warm up the audience and kind of orient us to where you guys are, can you raise your hands if you or your company or someone that you're involved with has a Scope 3 strategy in place? Cool. Okay, that's like 10%. That's interesting. Who is considering creating one? No one. Okay, also really illuminating. Another question, this one, I don't know, who's involved in or excited by or just at all adjacent to SB 253 implementation? Two, okay, great. There's so much room there. This is opportunity, I would say. Okay, so let's stay high level. Let's start by orienting ourselves in kind of physical and political and economic reality and just set the stage as to why we're having a panel about Scope 3 emissions right now, like what we talk about when we talk about Scope 3. I was hoping we could just start, maybe we'll start with Michael. Just situate us in a brief history of Scope 3, what it is, take us through a recent chronology that includes, incorporates what's going on with various standards and protocols, and then bring us up to date, characterize the state of the debate today.
Sure. Maybe it's easiest to start. I mean, I assume everyone's familiar. We're mainly talking about the GHG protocol here. First developed around 2000. First standard came out in 2001, and then quickly replaced by a revised standard that we all think about as the corporate standard in 2004. The idea of Scope 3, was there from the beginning. But it was kind of given, lower status in terms of how companies report emissions. The idea of a value chain was was there, but not a lot of guidance on it. And it wasn't until, and not many companies were doing anything about it. Like there were, it was early days that the kind of thinking there at the time was, let's get companies, we meaning kind of like the environmental community and others, let's get companies to just start thinking about their emissions, start doing some in kind of internal tracking. It wasn't really intended that seriously as a target setting process. There was no SBTi or other things like that. It was just like, let's put this on the radar screen of management, and start companies thinking about it. And enormous flexibility was in the framework. And Scope 3 was sort of like maybe some companies will do it one of these days. It was sort of mentioned. And then early 2010, 2011, when the final standard was released for Scope 3, it was like elevated in terms of much more rigorous guidance and whatnot. But even then, I mean, a few companies starting attempt to do it, realizing it was kind of difficult. And it wasn't until the more kind of recent era of more attention from the investor class. We have the new kind of securities rules coming out, things like SBTi and others starting to pick up on corporate target setting, that companies being expected to do Scope 3 and report on it, and targets kind of factoring in has really come into force. So it's a relatively, I mean, in terms of the 20 years that we've been kind of working on this, it's a relatively recent phenomenon. And I think one of the big you'll hear plenty from me in a minute probably. But one of the big challenges is that a lot of the things we're trying to use Scope 3 for, it was never designed for. It's not really clear actually what it was designed for, to be honest. The kind of rationale behind it is a little bit vague, other than the idea of we can transplant kind of product level life cycle assessment, take the kind of ideas from that and move it over into corporate level. Essentially, we can do a life cycle assessment on an entire company, and that a company is just a series of products coming into it and a series of products going out of it. And if we sort of do life cycle assessment on those things and smash them together somehow, it tells us something useful about a company that we can track over time. And maybe just to create some controversy to kick us off, I would argue that Scope 3 just doesn't work. It's broken. I think one of my board members, Craig Ebert, said it this morning, so it's great to hear. And I would argue we should just do away with it. And we can talk about why. And I would say the other half of the equation here of this session is on net zero. I also think we should do away with that. So I think the entire framework that's, I guess, arguably we're trying to use to drive demand for the carbon market, carbon credit purchasing, which I assume many of y'all are interested in here. I think we've got both parts of that formula wrong, both how we're defining corporate responsibility that's driving demand. I think we got that wrong in terms of Scope 3, because we're asking companies to take responsibility for this amorphous mass of a value chain that they can't even really identify what's in it, or know where it begins and ends. And then we're also asking them to take on targets based on this idea of compensation, of absolution of responsibility, which just is basically catnip to a press to attack people for not taking responsibility for their emissions when they can't really even quantify or do much about their emissions because of this expansive value chain, but then buying credits and trying to compensate for that problem, and then getting attacked for not taking moral responsibility for their emissions. Anyway, hopefully that creates some controversy enough to start things.
It sure does. Thank you for setting the stage. I'm going to I put a pin in that. That's awesome. Let's take it down a little. It's funny because I feel this conference used to be called Navigating the American Carbon World, right? And I feel, and now it's North American, and I feel like we're actually that's a more apt name, Navigating the American Carbon World, based on how you set the stage. But and I also like how you harken back to what Craig was saying earlier today, and that's one of the benefits of going last at a conference like this, because you can speak to all the things that have been said before. Let's keep it a little bit tamer for a minute.
I tried.
Yeah, no, you did. I love it. So Jessica and Mandy, you can speak to that. You can also just give your perspective on where we are right now and just the history and the chronology. But I was also hoping you could take us through what some of the options are for entities that are looking to do anything about Scope 3. What are the current options to mitigate? What are their options? Is it offsets of modeled estimates? Is it certificates? Is it partnering with suppliers? Is it, take us through what concretely people can do right now.
Do you want to go first?
I don't mind. Okay.
Thanks, Debra, and thanks, Michael, for that lovely introduction. I completely disagree with you. Not completely disagree with you. I think what Michael talks about in the history, the Scope 3 has been difficult. It has been complex. It is difficult, not has been. It is difficult. It is complex, and very hairy to get your head around when you start looking at drawing lines and doing calculations and the accounting. It is all very difficult. But what we're hearing, and we're talking about, I like navigating the American carbon world because it's not just the American carbon world, right? When we talk about Scope 3. When you look at those value chains and you look at the companies that are in the value chains of those companies that are wanting to take more climate action, a lot of them are not based in America. A lot of them are based in the global south, along that value chain. So when you talk about how do we deal with Scope 3 emissions, it is also thinking about how do you impact on those companies in the global south, those organizations along that value chain, and what can you do to ensure responsibility is placed at the right places. So it's not just about how do you reduce emissions, but how do you account for your value chain emissions that is based on your demand as an organization at the end of that value chain. And it is complex. It is not easy at all to do those calculations. But what we're finding is that a lot of corporates are not talking about should we or when should we, but how should we? How should we take care of our Scope 3 emissions? And a lot of corporates are very keen on looking at the solutions. And I saw a colleague from Verra walk into the room. They're an example of a company that's working closely with us as Verra to define how exactly we can take action and what are the options for mitigating Scope 3 emissions. So you may know that Verra has put out a Scope 3 program. It's out for public comment right now, actually. I think it closes on the 21st of April. And we would absolutely welcome all comments, especially from you, Michael, on the Scope 3 program. Because what we're looking at is to answer this question of complexity and to answer the question of how do we provide credible, flexible tools that companies can use to do the accounting around Scope 3 and to demystify some of it. Bearing in mind that nothing is perfect, right? No tool out there is perfect, but what is the best that we can do? So what we do with this program is we're trying to fill that gap of understanding how you can address Scope 3 accounting, how you can deal with some of the complexity, and we're looking at how the program can enable a company to track and claim value chain emissions transparently. I think what we're hearing from a lot of buyers, what we're hearing from a lot of companies is the traceability of that data is very important. Is there a way you can actually see how you trace that? And so we want to provide a standardized, as we normally do, science-based methodology in order to do that, and allowing companies then to look at that so that you can co-invest and co-claim. So I think those are some of the important parts of the program that we are looking to put together, and it's providing a tool. And like I say, it's some thinking that we've done together with some very progressive corporates like Verra, and more than happy for everybody to comment on it. And please do send us your comments, and that we want to hear what the market is thinking as well. I'll just stop there, Debra.
Sure. Yeah. So lots to talk about and follow up here, both of the panelists. I agree with Michael in that Scope 3 is very complex, and I think you mentioned that too, Mandy. But I don't think that we have time, I guess, to get everything perfect before we act. And so I think what ClimeCo is really focused on, what we're trying to help our clients navigate is how do you take action today with the tools that are available today. And of course, we're always, as an industry, we have this culture of continuous improvement, and I think that we will continue to make improvements in Scope 3, data collection, going to throw out AI, maybe that's going to help us with the management of data over time in this space, but right now we have to kind of figure out ways to move forward with what we have available to us. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done in this space. One of the I'm going to just bring up SBTi. I know that's going to come up in the conversation today. So SBTi has been a big driver of companies wanting to take action on their Scope 3 emissions. And there's been, up until just this past week, I think they released their version 2, a lot of uncertainty as to how companies could actually address that and stay, in compliance with their net zero targets in accordance with SBTi. So very excited to see that version 2 coming out, and it's going to help companies, start to frame up what actions they can take, what that Scope 3 mitigation looks like for them. And it's nice to see that there is some flexibility built into the new framework. I think still in consultation, so hard to say what the final version is going to end up looking like, but we're happy with that because like Michael mentioned, it is very complex, and I think being able to trace all your emissions to the source is pretty unrealistic. So having those kind of options of looking at supply shed and indirect mitigation options is going to be really important for companies.
Thanks. Let's get a little bit more into SBTi. Thank you for bringing it up. So the recent draft, it created more flexible ways for reducing Scope 3 emissions, right? But the role of offsets, I guess, remains limited to covering residual emissions. Is that right?
Yeah, I can speak first and then feel free to jump in. So the way that I'm reading it is that your residual emissions are the emissions that are going to be left when at your target year. So the year you're supposed to achieve net zero, those are your residual emissions, and you can use offset credits that are considered to be removals at that point to meet those. And then they've kind of taken this, if everyone's familiar with SBTi, they introduced a concept a couple of years ago called beyond value chain mitigation. They've taken that one step further in this draft version where they're encouraging companies and may even consider providing some sort of recognition for companies that kind of go above and beyond their net zero target and mitigate their what they're calling ongoing emissions until they're able to actually achieve those net zero or reduction targets. So it's kind of the emissions, let's say, for example, a company wants to implement a CCS project, and that's going to help them achieve 30% of their goal along the way. A CCS project might take 10 years to get off the ground, and so for those 10 years until you can actually realize those reductions, you can actually, in the draft, use carbon credits to address those ongoing emissions.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to talk more about how you're looking at the draft standard and if you're, how you guys feel about it?
Us.
No. No. Oh, right. Okay. So that's our take on SBTi. Okay. Do you think it should allow for more offsets, basically, or?
Yeah, I mean, that would be better. I think just my experience of working with companies in this space, it's really difficult to find a solution that works for every company. Their operations are so different, their supply chains are so different. You cannot necessarily even compare how easy or hard it is for a company to achieve Scope 1, 2, and 3 net zero targets because a bank's going to have very limited Scope 1 and 2, massive Scope 3, and then a cement plant's going to have, very large Scope 1 and 2, maybe not so high on the Scope 3. So it varies by company. So I think building in as much flexibility as you can into these frameworks and standards is just going to help more companies be able to kind of take credible action.
Right. Yeah, that gets back to, I like your analogy. I feel like it's like everyone's analogy is like building the plane while it's going down the runway or it's flying, or maybe we're just dragging our undercarriage like along the runway with like the wheels aren't there and it's just like sparks.
That would be my analogy.
So I guess which one of those analogies do you guys subscribe to, and talk about that tension? Because I also feel like it speaks to that tension between stringency and like getting companies to do this in kind of what is a policy vacuum essentially that we'll talk more about.
Mm-hmm. I can keep going unless someone else wants to.
Are we still talking SBTi? Then we won't.
Well,
Okay. 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 So, I guess. Well, we only just have the draft standard, and so even up until just this past week, or until we have the final draft, we still are in this kind of period of uncertainty. And so, the way we've been working with clients and our kind of approach to the space is we can't wait until we have these perfect solutions to take action. So I think we've just been recommending taking actions, being very transparent. I think that's the key about what you're doing, why you're doing it, how you're doing it, and making sure you're using the right language and not making it sound like you're doing more than what you are. So I think that's really the key to kind of protect against potential backlash until there are, those clear guidelines and standards.
Yeah.
I think perhaps what I'll just add to that is the entire mitigation strategy from a corporate has to be very clear. So it's not just about carbon credits or the offsets or where you're looking at residual emissions, but what is that full mitigation strategy and how you're reducing your direct emissions? So how are you dealing with scope 1 and scope 2? So that full transparency around that, and Jessica was talking about, transparency and reporting are key, and understanding how you're doing your accounting is very key. So I think that full mitigation strategy picture is quite important in this whole question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I'll just add the challenge here is, with some exceptions like cement, as you'll hear from many CDP and others, the majority of most companies' emissions are in this nebulous Scope 3 category. So I think part of the issue is that ends up kind of washing out in lots of different ways. One is like even if when they do take actions to reduce their, whatever Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 is another issue because then we'll get into a debate on RECs and other things. If the majority is supposedly in your Scope 3 and now we're focused on, Scope 1, 2, and 3 combined, then it just gets washed out, right? It's just kind of noise or there's no signal in the noise. And then broader, like when companies do, I'm sure many of you have probably heard about this, companies will make interventions with suppliers, like with a bunch of farmers way upstream in their supply chain or something. And then they have like no clear way to bring that into their inventory to show the actual impact they've made. Or it's, again, washed out because the value chain is like so expansive. Again, there's no signal in the noise. And so rightly so, companies are very frustrated by the situation, and that they're being told to take responsibility for this massive, collectively assigned bunch of emissions, which is at best very crudely quantified, and yet the system doesn't really give them any clear way to account for anything they do about it.
Which is where Verra comes in.
I was about to say, wait.
Yeah.
If you buy now.
Yeah.
So I think, that is exactly the kind of thing we're trying to address through the Verra program, is to look at your value chain example. So, the value chain, the farmer upstream, how do you account for that in your in your value chain as, say, a cereal company? So that's what the program is looking at, exactly that kind of thing. So completely understanding the complexity, I think what Jessica said is very important. You won't necessarily have 100% traceability, tracing every little thing back to you from your supply chain back to the company. So the program we're putting out is looking at how do you actually account for those things around your value chain, but also how do you do supplier engagement. So if you are a textile industry and you want to make sure that, we don't want to get into the nitty-gritty of Scope 2, but dealing with a textile industry and that you want to support renewables in that industry. It's not directly in your value chain. but adjacent to. So, we're also looking at those kind of interventions in the Scope 3 program.
Does this go to the question of like how can companies measure, or what's the best way to ask, can companies actually measure their Scope 3 emissions? Is there like a percentage? Is there, like a meter or something? Or how would you agree, to what degree would you agree with the statement? Companies can measure their Scope 3 emissions accurately?
I would say is it possible to quote unquote quantify a Scope 3 number? Yes. I mean, you can hire a consultant or someone that'll, type in some numbers into a, some sort of environmental extended input-output model and spit out some numbers. They'll be kind of industry averages, very crude. You ask 10 different consultants to do that analysis, and you'll get 10 different numbers, and they won't necessarily be close. So it's possible, but the question is really, like, what is that number telling me? Is it quote unquote sensitive enough to kind of measure over time what I'm supposedly need to measure and need to be tracking? And is it, appropriate for whatever the intended use is? In this case, you're usually talking about target setting type of applications, but there's others. I mean, the whole kind of, corporate risk assessment through the CSRD and SEC and California rules is all based on the assumption that this is also a measure of climate risk exposure of the company. So there's, and there's other uses too. You have to kind of think about, yes, can you quantify it? Yes. Is that quantification actually telling you what you think you need to know for the purpose you're trying to use it for? Unfortunately, in most cases, no, right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one thing I think about often is that a lot of the projects we work with in the industrial space, creating offsets, are in somebody's value chain. And they don't even necessarily know that those reductions are happening in their value chain. And so they might be reporting just a standard, emissions factor for the chemical or whatever it is that they're sourcing from, or the cement or whatever it is. I think there is more opportunity to help make those links, right? Make the link between where the reduction's happening and make companies aware that, hey, this is in your supply chain. You have the opportunity to report more accurate data and reduced CI, right? And then what's the value in that? So I think there's opportunity, but also challenges. And I think about, the word insetting, and I think that there's a supply side of insetting that I kind of work on, which is the project development side. So where those reduction opportunities actually are and kind of helping implement those projects, and then the demand side of companies who are reporting on those emissions and wanting to meet targets. And so I think the way that we're approaching both of those actually is a little bit different, and we need to keep that in mind as well.
So Michael had said that companies seem frustrated, and I'm wondering if that's what you guys are seeing or no, or if there's, like what are they doing right now? How are they reacting? Like what are you hearing from various companies about how they're changing their strategies or how they're making different decisions? And also, can you point to any companies specifically or just in the aggregate that are effectively addressing and mitigating their Scope 3 emissions? Like who's doing it? Who's doing it well? What are they doing?
I can start there. What we are hearing from companies is that they do want to do something about Scope 3 emissions, but they don't know how and what needs to be done and how do you account for it. And like Jessica was saying, how do you trace that the action you're taking is actually making a difference? So I think companies are not saying we don't want to do it, they're saying how can we do it in a way that makes sense. And if you remember that MSCI report, it's the companies that are taking the most climate action that are also looking to invest in beyond their value chain. And it's the companies that don't have very high Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. It's those that have, like you said, their highest is Scope 3, so they're trying to figure out how you do this. So when we started developing the Scope 3 program, we had quite a lot of corporates interested. And like I mentioned earlier, Verra, and there's a couple of others that we're working with to develop the program, because it's best to work with companies to do it. And I was actually, over lunch, we were just talking about the interest in Scope 3. And we're talking about an event at New York Climate Week that was held with SustainCert, who we have a MOU with to work more on DMRV on Scope 3 itself. And that was the most packed room that we were in for the whole of New York Climate Week. And it was packed with corporates wanting to understand how to do Scope 3 and how to do the accounting. And DMRV is very important for the traceability of all of that. So from a Verra perspective, and maybe I'm in an echo chamber, but from a Verra perspective, we are seeing that interest. And we're seeing companies asking, how can we do this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would echo that. I think from the clients that we work with are very interested in how they can take action. I think that, and we've been successful in actually, helping a couple of these in-setting type deals work. However, there is quite a bit of I guess fear in the risk of doing it wrong, right? Yeah. So companies want to make sure that they are doing this credibly and following the standards and frameworks. So I think that up until now, it's just been void of those things. And now that we have Verra's program, we have the SBTi guidance, we have the AIM platform are developing an in-setting framework as well. So there's all of these new tools. We have SustainCert coming to be available, and so hopefully I think that will drive more action in this space.
Right. And you're speaking, it's the fear of being accused of greenwashing, right?
That's right.
What it is. Okay. Yeah. That's what Craig was talking about very eloquently earlier. He was like, companies don't have to do a damn thing, and the risks are too high and the rewards are too low. And do you think, what will be the mechanism to change that? I feel like this is a discussion that we've been having for the past
for a while,
15 years maybe. But talk about where you see that going.
Yeah, I
can go for an hour.
Go
so.
You have 7 minutes.
I do think as an industry, we need to do a better job of fostering a culture of continuous improvement. And I think that, recognizing that, just using offsets as an example, offset methodologies, using a methodology today and creating a volume of reductions is probably going to be found to be wrong in 5-10 years time when we have better tools, better technology, the science improves, whatever it is. That doesn't make the action wrong that was taken 10 years before. And I think we maybe need to think about how we are talking about and framing up our industry and kind of the limitations of it, right? And being a little bit more forthcoming so that people understand that, we're using the best tools available, and then as we get better and as we learn more, we will make those changes, and that should be viewed as a positive rather than a negative.
Yeah, I had a great analogy the other day where somebody said, we had the iPhone 1. I don't know if you guys, I don't even know what an iPhone 1 looked like. And you were able to make a phone call on it. We now have iPhone 16, and we go back and say, but why didn't the iPhone 1 do all this great stuff that iPhone 16 can do? And it's the same thing with methodologies and the way we're looking at how we're addressing emissions and offsets and all of that. We're going back and looking at the old stuff and saying, why didn't we do it then? It's because we didn't know then. So, when we know better, we do better. And that's how all of this methodology updates that we do, for example, happens, is because when we know better, we do better. And so I think the narrative, and we often talk about it we're in this VCM world, the voluntary carbon market world, the climate action world, the corporate action world. We sometimes are our own worst enemies because, we poke holes in all of the various things we're doing rather than thinking about what is the progress we've been made, how do we continually improve, and how can we do better. And so corporates that want to take action on Scope 3, we should be looking at how to enable that rather than saying, gosh, what are you guys doing? How are you ever going to be able to account for it? It's not going to be 100% traceable. But actually, how do we enable them to do what they actually want to do and take action on Scope 3 emissions?
Mm-hmm. That's so fascinating philosophically. I mean, just because, we embrace concepts like permanence and 100 years, stuff like that. So, again, building the plane as it's flying, I guess. Did you have any thoughts that you wanted to.
How much time do I have left? No. Yeah, to maybe go full circle and continue being controversial. I mean, I think, for example, the issue of traceability, I think we just have that all wrong. Like, we shouldn't matter. Like, who cares? We should just do away with the whole idea of traceability. Like, why are we defining a corporate responsibility in this kind of massively collective, ambiguous way that companies don't know how to do anything about? Like, if we had kind of clear lines of kind of corporate responsibility around things that they could actually measure and take responsibility for, meaning that it's like things that either that are direct emissions or it's like they're kind of close-in suppliers that they actually have a relationship with and can get data from and then can influence and partner with and help implement mitigation with, that should be enough. And then, in addition, we should have a separate framework, call it consequential, call it intervention, we call it contribution, where companies set goals to do, mitigation projects, buy credits, do other kind of interventions with their farther out supply chain, the stuff that they can't really account for and measure very easily, but they can still do projects in it and account for the actual project impacts of it and set goals for those kind of interventions. And then we get out of this doom loop of companies being told to take responsibility for things that they can't really take responsibility for, then going to buy credits to try and compensate for that, and then getting critiqued for buying their way out of taking responsibility for their emissions. I just say we've got the whole their responsibility or their emissions, we got that wrong. We need to rethink that in a more rigorous way. The GHG protocol was not set up to do this. I was there, I was one of the authors. We didn't think about it this way. It wasn't done rigorously enough. We sat on our laurels for 20 years, didn't update it to be appropriate for the kind of things we're trying to use it for. And now we actually are trying to update it. We're in the middle of an update process with the GHG protocol, with ISO, with SBTi. But now we really are. We're building the plane, or trying to fly the plane or rebuild the plane, and we're dragging the wrong way, big time.
I have to ask though, okay, but companies, since their motivation to do this is largely, and we can talk about their motivations, but my perception is that it's largely reputational. Does this kind of vision that you're setting out give them enough of that?
Yeah, it does take a shift, and I'm curious what y'all think. It does take a shift in that there would still be target setting for built around a accountability framework, which I think accountability framework that is built underneath it on sort of a massively collective sense of responsibility, meaning everyone's scope 3 is everyone else's scope 3. That's just the nature of value chains. It doesn't really work. Another way to think about it is no one can kind of be net zero with respect to scope 3 until everyone else is net zero, because most of your emissions are also everyone else's emissions. And in my mind, if the driver here is recognition, and the only way I get recognition is, going net zero, whatever that, but massively reducing my emissions. But my emissions are everyone else's emissions, so I can't do that until everyone else does that. But again, the whole system's driven by recognizing leaders, but no one can be, again, I'm being circular here because it's a circular argument, but no one can be a leader until everyone else is a leader. If we've set up a system to fail?
Good question.
Yeah, who's got that coffee? I think it's beyond recognition, though. For me, I think why companies want to have some sort of traceability is because of the investment. Because who's going to pay for that mitigation, or who's going to pay for that dealing with those emission reductions? And so one of the things we're doing in our program is looking at how do you do that traceability so that you can have co-investment and co-claiming. So I think this beyond the recognition is trying to figure out who's going to pay for what, which I think is a big part of that. So I agree with Michael. Unless we all do something, then it's all of our scope 3 is all of our scope 3. And when you think about scope 3, I was thinking about it before this panel and coming up with some clever analogies on how to describe it. There aren't any because it's very difficult. It's very difficult to describe it. So it is your scope 3 is everybody else's scope 3. And we all need to do something about it. But I think it is important from a company perspective to understand how much do you invest and where do you invest.
Did you want to chime in? You don't have to.
Yeah, no.
One little thing. Okay, so is it that scope 3, everyone's scope 3, like or is it scope 1? Like I thought it was more. No.
Yeah,
Okay.
no.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's a miss. Yeah, I mean, that's GHG protocol has been not very clear on this, but yeah. So scope 1 is also double counted with scope 3, and same with scope 2, and that's by design, you know. But what's not sort of, I guess, as well understood as and they say there's no double counting within scope 1 typically. I mean, you want to get technical, we can talk about consolidation approaches and equity versus blah, blah, blah. But anyway, in theory. But that rule doesn't apply to scope 3. Like there is not just double counting, there is, I guess, multiplicative counting to the nth degree in scope 3.
Okay. Thank you for explaining that. I feel more educated. Let's talk a little bit. I know that it's kind of divorced from a policy conversation, but I want to talk about policy a bit and how that affects companies' motivations. I mean, so you say that there was a lot of interest. The room was packed at Climate Week. That was before the election, right? So what are current motivations to address scope 3 like now? Like if a business wasn't doing it, why would they do it now? You know, there's disclosure requirements for scope 3. There will be, right, in California. There are in the EU currently, right? And there's bills in New York and Washington and New Jersey, but there's no federal rule now. SEC rule is dead, and there's nothing requiring mitigation, right? So kind of take a step back and like talk about where appetite would be coming from and where you see the market going.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can start. So I think from my perspective, companies are taking, or the smart ones anyway, are taking a long-term kind of view at this. So I think what we're going through right now, short-term policy, going backwards a little bit, but that's probably not always going to be that way. And so to make sure you're staying relevant for the future, kind of future-proofing your business, globally, we're moving towards a low carbon economy. So if you want to keep up, you have to continue on that journey. So I think that, potentially those companies who had set net zero targets but really had no intention of ever meeting them, maybe they're gonna kind of fall by the wayside, but that doesn't really actually detract from the action that was going to be taken anyway.
Yeah, if I could just add, this was always voluntary anyway. There were no regulation or policy, and those rooms that I was talking about at New York Climate Week were filled with companies wanting to take voluntary action. And like Jessica says, those were the progressive companies that are still looking to do that. We've had, after the elections, we had quite a number of engagements with various corporates that we were invited into, and they just reiterated their support. I mean, I'm not wearing rose-colored glasses, so there are those that will go back and walk back on some of their commitments. But I think the majority of companies understand that the climate doesn't care about political whims, right? So it's still a risk mitigation strategy to deal with climate and to take mitigation action and to look at adaptation and those kinds of things. So the companies that are forward-thinking are seeing that, and so I think it's important to recognize that those are the progressive companies that are still taking action, were the ones that did it voluntarily anyway in the past.
Okay. Any thoughts, Michael?
I still do think it's primarily within corporate reporting, kind of the scope 3 net zero realm. I would still argue it's primarily recognition that's being driven, most of it. With the exception of the securities kind of disclosure rules around publicly traded companies in some cases. But I think part of that recognition, or subset, an important subset of that recognition that I think we don't talk about enough is there are actually many companies I think are doing it for internal recognition. Basically, a lot of tech firms that are trying to attract top talent, and they want to appear, and with substance behind it, want to be kind of good global citizens, corporate citizens. I live in Seattle, and not, I guess if you live in the Bay Area, it's probably similar. I mean, you see it every day. I mean, there is real battles going on to attract talent, and like anything you can do to show that you're a company that those kind of people want to work for makes a big difference. And I think that so that kind of recognition, as well as external recognition, is still a main driver for companies, taking these kind of scope 3 commitments.
Mm-hmm. There is actually also, studies, and I don't know the exact numbers, but, that actually, and I think this is mostly for consumer packaged goods companies, CPGs, but consumers are wanting low carbon products. They are wanting environmentally friendly products. They're willing to pay more. They will search them out on the shelf. What they don't want are, greenwashing type labels on those products. So I think companies recognize, in order to put a credible label on that product, you need to make a credible intervention in your scope 3 emissions. And so I think consumers actually have a lot of influence in the direction companies are going.
And you do see that in Europe, where they've put in tighter restrictions, kind of FTC type restrictions on these kind of claims, carbon neutral, blah, 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 and just, holding companies more to account for that because of that dynamic. So.
But I think also moving away from the global north and, the requirements there from consumer awareness and consumer requirements, and trying to attract talent into companies that are seen to be progressive. If you look at the actual impacts of climate change in many of the global south countries, where these things are being experienced and people in those communities cannot afford to adapt, is where the kind of interventions that corporates in the global north are making makes an absolute difference, a huge difference to communities. So whenever we talk about philosophical discussions around scope 3 and traceability and measuring and why we do this, I always think back to our 2,500 plus projects that we support in Kenya, Brazil, Senegal, and how it impacts those communities. So I think taking action on climate is something that those corporates continue to do, because not just for the carbon benefit, but because they actually care about those communities as well, which is laudable. And it might be, Michael, it might be recognition, but I do think investment matters and who pays matters. And companies don't want to take, and shouldn't take the responsibility for paying, willy-nilly for scope 3 emissions. So the traceability and understanding where you should be paying is quite important.
Yeah, no, I would say, those projects should, companies should get recognized for doing those kind of projects around the world. We should be encouraging them to do more of them. We should be making it easier for climate finance to flow, whether it's voluntary or public. We should make it easier for companies to get recognized when they do stuff that does have a positive impact, and make it kind of clear and give them a structured reporting framework that's well recognized and not complicated, and doesn't require them going through all sorts of traceability loops and converting emission factors into adjusted emission factors and bringing it into my inventory and making a book and claim thing, and then coming up with residual factors to readjust the rest of their inventory, and then telling the rest of the world about how they have to adjust their life cycle factor to account for my intervention. I mean, that's our current world right now, and no one knows how to do it. Or we could just say, do an intervention, we'll go through a credible process to show what kind of impact it's having, report it, we'll set a goal for it, and we'll recognize for you, and it'll be great.
I like the simple world. I like the simple world.
Wow. Okay. Is there, I guess, okay, so we're talking
That
about...
was a memeable moment.
Yeah.
Recorded that.
Let's make like a joke out of it. Okay, so we're talking a lot about like consumer sentiment and where the market is and how people feel about it, and employee pressure, which I think is such a big question. Especially I don't know. I live in San Francisco. I feel like half of San Francisco would go work for Doge right now. Like I feel like the question of tech employees' political leanings is very ripe right now.
Happy to be in Seattle right now.
Yeah. So I don't know. I guess where I would go with that is there anything kind of larger, like economic forces, for example, the influx of AI and data centers and stuff like that, that would also drive demand for compliance. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, if we're talking about scope 3, then I think yes. You know, they use a lot of cement, for example, to build, and I think to be able to, for these tech companies to be able to say we are, you know, meeting our net zero targets, they need low carbon cement, and so they need ways to be able to credibly account and track and trace and say we're using low carbon cement. So yes, I think that there are these kind of macro factors happening right now that are impacting maybe which scope 3 areas will be focused on first, some more than others, I think, yeah.
If I could just give an example as well from my very murky past where I worked in the coal industry. I worked in the electricity industry and tried to get them to move from coal to renewables. One of the biggest requests we had were from tech companies to say, can we co-locate our data centers where you are trying to build renewables so that we can have, you know, clean energy towards our data centers and things. So there is that pressure as well. Not always being able to meet that, but that is something that a lot of big tech companies are looking for.
Great. Okay. We'll open it up for questions if anyone has any. I'm particularly curious. I've noticed there's not a lot of corporates here at the conference, I don't think. So if there's anyone here who is corporate or adjacent or just can share what you're thinking right now, I would love to know that.
My name is Craig Jacobson. I work for a company called True Manufacturing. We're the largest manufacturer of commercial refrigeration equipment in North America. So we're U.S. manufacturer. Tariffs are giving me a huge headache.
Oh.
Anyway, scope 3 is also giving me a huge headache. Like you said, I mean, I could not hear the truth louder from you about how complicated, convoluted, and difficult to trace, and so you ask the motivation. Yeah, it's customer driven for sure. We're business to business. We sell to Coke and Pepsi and Red Bull and Monster and all of these other companies that are super recognizable to consumers, and so they're, like you said, the consumer choice for a preference of companies that care and want to make an impact is definitely there, and then that bubbles up to the businesses that we sell, and then they leverage that kind of influence on us, and then we leverage it up the supply chain, and there's something about that that works pretty well.
Yeah. But it dilutes over.
It dilutes,
Over.
and then while we have some leverage over our suppliers, how many places can you go to buy aluminum? You know, how many places can you go to buy steel, right? Like 20? You know, I mean, so you can kind of horse trade a little bit. You can say, hey, I want you guys to do a little bit better because they're doing a little bit better. But at the end of the day, you can't make something from nothing.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, that's what I think one of the reasons why I think I was saying at the beginning, having more flexibility and the ability to use market-based mechanisms is really important because, like you said, I think where the demand is for the low-carbon product isn't necessarily where you can feasibly implement the low-carbon product. And so being able to use book and claim, credits, aggregating, disaggregating attributes from products. I think all of those things, all of the above, should be options for companies because it's hard to make a one solution fit for every situation.
Right. And so, our scope 3 emissions are, 85% of our total emissions, right? So, and then when we want to make commitments that would reduce our overall emission footprint over time, it's difficult to make a commitment without real leverage on the supply chain, other than, yes, we're a pretty big manufacturer and we have some leverage to levy, but it's still a bit of an unknown future there. So I don't have a great answer, but it is refreshing to hear that I'm not the only one that thinks it's a little bit crazy and convoluted and challenging to actually make impact on those scope 3 emissions. I want that. I want to reduce emissions. I want a low carbon future. I want to have, we make already the, cleanest and greenest and lightest on the environment as you can for a refrigerator. But, again, you can't make something from nothing. So there's going to be some sort of energy requirement to keep people's food cold. And that's something that everybody needs.
Yeah, and I would just add, as I said, your ability to influence whatever, yeah, I mean, you have some, but then you're influencing, your supplier, you're trying to get them to influence their supplier, and, there's a dilution there, again, because we're operating in a voluntary context here where doesn't have targets and whatnot. Like if everyone was mandatory required to do all this stuff and take targets, then yeah, I would say we don't need corporate reporting at all. We'd just go regulate everything. And we could do away with this. But I would argue, and hopefully you would agree, like if you could just focus on the few maybe, major source categories in your tier 1 and tier 2 suppliers where like the procurement kind of policies that you put in place can make a difference. And you report, you can get actual data from whatever the aluminum manufacturer or whatnot. Just make that clean and simple and not trying to do all this other stuff. And then, you can use that leverage and show it in your inventory. And then also do some sort of, book and claim, or I wouldn't call it book and claim, but certificate type mechanism for some other aluminum plant in Iceland or wherever else that's been putting in place some, green power or high tech aluminum process. Aluminum may not be the example. Steel would probably be better examples, but and then report that as a contribution in terms of avoided emissions. Similar to a credit. Would be the way to do it. I mean, the trick is, picture in your head, imagine a world where, and this is where we're currently sort of headed. We have certificates for SAF, for sustainable aviation fuel. There's already like green steel certificates. There's a number of other things. We're heading toward a world, kind of this book and claim, at least model, where there may be thousands of different kinds of certificates out there for everything, all making different kind of emission factor claims, meaning that you get to replace the emissions in your inventory with some other emission factor, essentially kind of redoing your boundaries or re-estimating your inventory. Each one of them having their own characteristics, their own kind of supply-demand dynamics, their own kind of quality, so to speak. We can get into things about additionality and impact if we want. Each one of those have to be evaluated. We have to come up with some sort of justification for why one counts and one doesn't count. And every time someone proposes a new one, have some evaluation process. I just think that's a crazy world.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Yeah, agreed.
What I guess I wouldn't want the takeaway to be from this session, though, is that it's so complicated, we're not going to do anything,
No.
right? So I think don't get disheartened. I think there are ways where you can simplify, and I think, like Michael said, try to just identify one or two realistic opportunities where you can act, where you can make an impact, and just try not to get too lost in the whole weeds of it.
Yeah, I think, the takeaway is look at Verra's program, free program, because that's exactly what we're advocating for, is how to simplify that, because you don't have influence over your whole supply chain, but where you can have influence and make a difference, you should be credited for that.
I would echo that and just add, I know it's tough. I mean, don't have a ton of companies here, I guess, but I know it's tough to do this because typically as a company, you're looking for that external validation, right? You want the SBTi, you want the GG protocol. You want everyone to tell you that this is okay. But if anyone's, if you're paying attention, then, that process is not moving exactly at lightning speed. And it's arguably 10 plus years, kind of late. These problems weren't, we knew about them a decade ago, and it just wasn't dealt with. So I would just encourage companies to do what, if you agree with to some degree what you hear, do what you think makes sense. Take responsibility for the missions you think it makes sense for you to take responsibility for, and just I don't want to say screw the protocol, but make interventions, whether it's buying credits or working, making an investment or helping some farmers way up in your value chain, supply shed, implement some no-till agriculture or something like that, quantify that impact in terms of avoided emissions. You can use some of the methodologies that Verra has to help you do that, and report that, separately from your inventory and said, this is what we think it's reasonable for us to take responsibility for. This is our plan, as Mandy says, our pathway to try and reduce that. These are some other great things we're doing. I wouldn't call it beyond value chain. I'm just saying these are some other great things we're doing. Some of it is sort of in our value chain. Some of it might be beyond it. Sometimes we don't even know because where value chains ends is unclear. These are our avoided emissions impacts. Google and Train are already doing this. They're taking kind of like goals toward, Google, I think, calls it a gigaton challenge. They're taking these goals. If these are things we're going to do to like help global mitigation, report that, and try and make the world look like what you think it should look like. And because a lot of this is I'm involved in all these standard setting processes, and we get in this circles. Well, this is not what companies are already, used to doing, so we can't make any changes to make this better because, this is the status quo. We can't shake it up. So if companies just start to change that status quo and make it seem like this is the way we think should be done, standards, we need you to come along with us.
Yeah, one last question.
Thanks. I'm Debra from Carbon Containment Lab. I previously worked for about 10 years on supply chain sustainability, and I just want to offer that there's a whole world of tools already out there to look at your own supply chain, also upstream, look at your own products and waste and whatnot from the green purchasing world. And we've been through this process of evaluating standards and labels, figuring out meta standards, etc. And a lot of that infrastructure is there already and just can be built upon for climate. And I think the challenge is often, with large purchases, like I work with GSA and Microsoft and others, is they're buying from so many categories across hundreds, in some cases hundreds of countries. And then you go, it's just too big. And so you have to use analytical tools, you have to prioritize, as you said. You have to think about, okay, where can we have an impact? What do we actually want to do? And then you can figure out the accounting as you go along. But I see a lot of paralysis by analysis happening, or just not even doing that, just people fearing this. And it's like, you got to take it one step at a time.
Yeah, baby steps,
One thing I would just avoid doing is adding to the noise by surveying your own suppliers, because they're getting the survey.
Yeah.
And they're all a little bit different to each other. So there's standard platforms for doing that, and please look at those and use them rather than just kind of, making this an even more complex situation. But it's a great,
although
there's so much opportunity at the same time deep down in the supply chain. So.
Thank you.
I just use the example of, and he's here, Chris Davis used to be at Amazon. Ask Amazon how they deal with their Scope 3. And we won't get into can you just pull together some of the modeling tools or EPDs and expect Amazon to come up with useful way of tracking things. I would question it.
Okay. Well, it sounds like we found a way out of the doom loop. Do what you can. Thank you to everyone and our panelists very much for this great discussion. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.